I shall perhaps take the liberty of commencing with a brief personal note and outlining my own role in these discussions concerning philosophical matters. I want it to be perfectly clear from the outset that I am emphatically not a guru. That is to say, I speak about what we term these subjects, which encompass a myriad of interests touching upon Oriental philosophy, psychotherapy, religion, mysticism, and so forth. I talk about these subjects because they interest me and because I derive pleasure from speaking about them. And after all, every sensible individual makes his living doing what he finds enjoyable, and that quite simply explains me. Now, as I've said, I am emphatically not a guru. This also implies that I am not attempting to assist you or to improve you. I embrace you just as you are. I'm certainly not setting out to rescue the world. Of course, when a fresh, bubbling spring flows forth from the mountains, it is merely performing its nature. If a parched traveler avails himself, well, that's entirely satisfactory. When a bird sings, it doesn't sing for the furtherance of musicality, but if someone pauses to listen and is gladdened, that's perfectly fine. And thus, I speak in the same spirit. I do not maintain a group of followers. I am not trying to acquire disciples because I operate on the principle of a doctor rather than a cleric. A doctor is constantly endeavoring to be rid of his patients, to dispatch them, made whole, so they can stand independently. Whereas a cleric is seeking to gather them as members of a religious institution so they will consistently contribute their dues, pay down the debt on the edifice, cover the costs, and generally adhere to the organization, thus boosting its census and, by sheer numerical power, proving the truthfulness of its tenets. My ultimate goal is truly to be rid of you so that you will have no further need of me or any other instructor. I'm concerned that some of my colleagues would not endorse that perspective, because there is a widespread belief and assertion that in order to progress in the spiritual life, whatever that might be, it is absolutely essential to secure a guru and to offer that guru perfect submission. Thus, I am frequently asked the question, is it truly imperative to have a guru? I can only respond to that by saying, yes, it is necessary, if you believe so. In the very same spirit as it is often said that anyone who consults a psychiatrist should have his head examined. Of course, there is more depth to that statement than first appears, because if you are genuinely and sincerely preoccupied with yourselves and are in such a state of perplexity that you feel compelled to consult a psychiatrist to discuss your condition, then naturally you must go. Similarly, if you require someone to direct you on how to practice meditation or how to achieve a state of liberation, nirvana, moksha, or whatever it might be termed, and you feel that need acutely, then you must pursue it. Because, as the poet William Blake articulated, the fool who persists in his folly will become wise. However, I do wish to make this point. What is the root of a guru's authority? He may inform you that he speaks from experience, that he has undergone states of consciousness that have rendered him deeply joyful or insightful or compassionate or whatever the case may be, and you have his assurance for it. And you have the testimony of others who, in like manner, concur with him. But each of them, and you in turn, agree with him based on your own judgment and by your own assessment. And so it is you who are the origin of the teacher's authority. And that holds true whether he speaks as an individual or whether he speaks as the representative of a tradition or a religious organization. You may claim that you accept the Bible as your authority or the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic following will very often state that the private mystical experience is not to be relied upon due to its susceptibility to being interpreted in a purely personal and capricious manner, and that it must be safeguarded against excesses by the objective and substantial traditions of the Church. But those traditions are deemed substantial and objective only because those who follow them believe them to be so. They state so. And if you follow it, you say so. So the matter circles back to you. Why do you believe? Why do you form this opinion? On what foundation does all this rest? Well, naturally, almost everyone is seeking help. Unless when I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any way. But there is this sense, this certain helplessness of being alone and somewhat perplexed in an unpredictable way by the occurrences in the external world. And these world events include a vast measure of suffering, of tragedy, and we ask ourselves why we are here, how we arrived here, and in short, what to do about the capital P, problem of capital L, life to which should be appended death, because it appears certain that we are all going to die, and that death might be a painful process, as will those we cherish. And so, what then? Is there any way in which we can become masters of the circumstance? Well, there exist all manner of attempts to flee from the human predicament of being a solitary, isolated consciousness amidst this immense and wayward not self. We can, of course, try to conquer the game on a material level by becoming exceedingly affluent or extremely powerful. We may employ every sort of technology to alleviate our suffering, hunger, pain, illness, and so forth. But it will be observed that as we achieve success in these endeavors, we remain unsatisfied. In other words, if you feel at this moment that a rise in your income would resolve your issues, and you get an increase in income, this would provide you a pleasant sensation for a few weeks. But then, as you well know, if that has ever occurred to you, the feeling dissipates, and you might commence worrying about getting sick. There is perpetually something to fret about. And if you are extremely wealthy indeed, you still harbor anxieties concerning illness and mortality, as well as worries about upheaval and whether the Internal Revenue Service will seize everything from you or catch you cheating on your taxes or imprison you for no sound reason. There is always this concern. And so you come to realize that the problem of life does not genuinely reside in your external conditions, because you fret regardless of what they are. The problem consists, rather, in what you refer to as your mind. Could you, by some technique, regulate your mind so that you cease to worry? And how on earth would you achieve that? Well, there are those who inform you that the ideal solution is to cultivate positive thoughts, to be tranquil, to breathe leisurely, hum softly, and usher yourself into a peaceful state of mind by reiterating affirmations such as all is light, all is God, all is good, or whatever it may be. But unfortunately, it does not always work, because you harbor a nagging suspicion in the back of your mind that you are merely hypnotizing yourself and whistling in the dark what the Germans term a Hintergedanke, which is a thought hidden far, far in the back. But it has an annoying persistence. What if? And so you discern that this endeavor of controlling the mind is no shallow undertaking, because although you may be able to smooth the ripples of your conscious awareness, there is beneath that a vast domain of unconsciousness, which erupts as unpredictably as events in the outer world. And so you seriously contemplate the potential of psychoanalysis to descend and enter those depths and see if oil can be poured upon those troubled waters. And then, naturally, you enter into the guru pursuit. You must seek out someone against whose mirror you can reflect those aspects of yourself of which you are not directly conscious. So, as the procedure continues, you find there is something uncomfortable about all this. And this awkwardness can be articulated in many diverse ways. One of them is this: how on earth are you to access yourself, to effect change upon yourself? Because it is a project not unlike attempting to kiss the point of one pin with the point of the very same pin. In other words, if you feel you could benefit from some sort of psychological or spiritual improvement, you are clearly the entity who is going to have to instigate this. But if you are the one who requires enhancement, how are you going to bring that to pass? You are in the predicament of trying to elevate yourself off the ground by tugging at your own bootstraps. And as you all know, that cannot be done. And if you try to do so, you are likely to land with a thud on your backside and be further down than you were initially. So that conundrum continuously emerges, and it has arisen historically in all the great religious traditions. We encounter it in Christianity in the dispute between St. Augustine and Pelagius. And Pelagius asserted that if God had given us a commandment to love him and to love our neighbors, he would not have done so unless we were capable. St. Augustine retorted and said, yes, but the commandment was not given in order for it to be obeyed. God never expected that it would be obeyed because we were incapable of loving anyone but ourselves. The commandment was, therefore, given to convince us of our sinfulness, from which we could be rescued only by divine grace, that is to say, by the infusion into our souls of a power beyond them. And that was more or less the doctrine to which the Church assented. The enigma has always persisted, then, how to obtain grace. Because grace is apparently freely offered to all, but some individuals seem to receive it and some do not. With some, the medicine works, and with others, it doesn't. Why? Well, apparently, you possess the power to resist grace, but if you do, you also possess the power not to resist it. We would therefore like to know how not to resist it and to be receptive. And there, you see, we are back at precisely the point where we began. It's like saying, you must relax, let go, give in. And I know I ought to let go. I know I should abandon my will to the divine will. But to will is present with me. But how to perform that which is good, I find not. For the good that I would, I do not, and the evil that I would not, that I do. In other words, we all arrive at a fundamental core within ourselves, which we will call, since we are in a Jewish temple, the Yetzer Hara, or the wayward spirit, which God is supposed to have placed into the soul of Adam, or, in my translation, our element of irreducible rascality, where we are all fundamentally scamps. And if you haven't discovered that, you are profoundly unconscious. I know all sorts of people who are full of outward love, but of course, it invariably turns out that they require money. And when it comes to money, virtue flies out of the window. So we do possess that element within ourselves. We know it very well. And the question is, therefore, once again, how can it be transformed? But if the transformer is the one who is afflicted, who transforms the transformer? It's the perennial problem of who guards the guards, who polices the policeman, who governs the government. And it seems perfectly logical, for that reason alone, that it is a vicious circle. There is a great deal of discussion concerning two selves, the lower self, or ego, and the higher self, called the spirit or the Atman. And the duty of the Atman seems to be to transform the wretched little ego, or sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. So we ask, why doesn't so-and-so's Atman succeed in breaking through? Is his ego too formidable? If so, who will weaken it? Is his Atman too feeble? And if so, why? For surely aren't all Atmans the same? The puzzle persists. So let's examine what we are trying to accomplish. We are trying to improve. We are pursuing that type of experience which we will label the positive, the good, the light, the living, and to distance ourselves from the negative, the evil, the dark, and the dead. Unfortunately, however, human experience, human consciousness, knows by contrast. We are equipped with a nervous system where the neurons either fire or don't fire. All that we are aware of is composed of an extraordinarily complex arrangement of yes and no, and by recording on magnetic tape, it utilizes impulses. There are regions where there is a pulse, and there are regions where there is not a pulse. And by proceeding in this manner, we can capture almost any form of human experience. In other words, we can put color television onto the tape so that it is all reduced to a matter of yes or no. And you will understand, of course, that that is the philosophy of the Chinese Book of Changes, the I Ching, which represents all the situations of life in terms of combinations of the yang, or positive principle, and the yin, or negative principle. Interestingly enough, a Latin translation of the I Ching was read by the philosopher Leibniz. And from this, he conceived of binary arithmetic, wherein all numbers can be represented by 0 and 1, And that is the number system employed by the digital computer, which underlies all our electronic ingenuity, this great extension of the nervous system, which is based on the same principle. But you observe what we are striving to do. We are trying to have yang without yin. We are trying to engineer a life game in which there is winning without losing. Now, how can you arrange such a state of affairs? A game in which everyone wins would end up, as W.S. Gilbert expressed it, when everybody is somebody, then no one's anybody. If we are all uniformly blissful, it becomes impossible to recognize that we are happy because a certain flatness descends over everything. If we were to elevate all valleys and lower all mountains, we would have the sort of thing they are attempting to do with bulldozers in the Hollywood Hills, to the detriment of the ecology, in ghastly fulfillment of the biblical prophecy, where every valley shall be exalted and every mountain laid low, and the rough places made plain. And I'm sorry to say it was Isaiah who made that remark. But the same Isaiah also uttered something that at least Christians do not often quote, which is the subsequent sentence, I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace, and I create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. In spite of which, everyone is busily trying to be good, not comprehending that we would not recognize saints unless they had their vices, or sages unless they were fools. And there is no way out of that predicament. That is why Buddhism represents existence in terms of a wheel, or the Bhavakakra, the wheel of the perpetual cycle of birth and death. And at the summit of that wheel, there are devas, people whom we would call angels, and at the base of the wheel, there are naraka, or tormented people in purgatory. And you revolve round and round, now this way, now that way. It's truly like a squirrel cage, where you're running and running and running to reach the top, and yet you have to run faster and faster just to maintain your position. And that's why there is always the sense that the more you succeed in any measure of either worldly or spiritual advancement, the more you have the haunting feeling that you're still in the exact same place. So you contemplate, now there must be some way out of that. Perhaps there's something arrogant and prideful and incorrect in aspiring to be enlightened or compassionate. Perhaps there's a significant dose of spiritual pride in believing that I, by my efforts, could transform myself into a Buddha or a saint. And therefore, perhaps the appropriate action is to try to eliminate all desire, not only the desire for worldly success, but likewise the desire for spiritual success. For the Buddha proposed that desire was the origin of suffering, and therefore suggested to his listeners that if they eliminated desire or clinging, they might cease from suffering. But you must understand that the so-called teachings of the Buddha are not doctrines in the sense that the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims possess doctrines. They are proposals. They are the initial steps in a dialectic. And if you go away and try not to desire in any way, you will very quickly discover that you are desiring not to desire. And so we very rapidly arrive at a situation where you discover that with respect to your own transformation, everything you try to do about it simply doesn't work. It may yield some kind of temporary success to make you feel better, but time and again you return to the same old gnawing problem. And that is why individuals interested in spiritual matters tend to migrate from one sect to another, from one teacher to another, always hoping that they will encounter one who holds the solution. Of course, then there are many teachers who say, indeed, there is nothing you can do. And yet, therefore, you have to practice non-doing, as the Taoists call it Wu Wei, non-striving. But then you find, in turn, that it's extraordinarily difficult not to strive. It's like trying not to think of a green elephant, and immediately you think of it. And so you arrive at the dismal conclusion that you can neither achieve what you wish to achieve, that is to say, liberation from the alternation of the opposites by striving, nor can you achieve it by not striving. And thereby you've learned that you cannot concentrate on purpose. It's like trying to be unself-conscious on purpose, or to be genuine on purpose, or to love on purpose. When you say, I ought to love, well, that places you in a double bind. And we say of a person, well, he's trained himself to be deliberately unself-conscious, or he has very disciplined spontaneity. What we were seeking was someone whose spontaneity was genuine, so that the scaffolding didn't show. And we believe that there are some people like children, but they don't know how interesting they are, and when they find out, they become brats. Imagine for a moment that it was your privilege to have a brief interview with God, in the course of which you were allowed to ask one question. What would you ask? Now, you would have to consider this over very carefully, because this golden opportunity would come to you only once, and it would have to be most important that you didn't ask a silly question. Well, you might try God out with a Zen Buddhist koan, such as beyond the positive and the negative. What is reality? And the Lord would turn to you and say, my dear child, your question has no meaning. And you wouldn't have the opportunity to think of a meaningful one and return. So perhaps you should have asked, what question should I ask? And the Lord would say to you, why do you want a question? It seems you do so because you feel that something is wrong if you don't have a specific goal. That is the insoluble problem of trying to win without losing. Now, as long as you maintain that problem, you will be occupied. Only, however, until you recognize that it cannot be solved. But there are all sorts of methods of presenting that problem in such a way that you cannot see that it's meaningless. And the better gurus are very clever at bringing these methods forward. You may see, for example, if you are invited to practice intense concentration, that after a while you find yourself thinking about concentrating, and therefore that your concentration is somewhat divided. Or he may ask you, why are you concentrating? What is your motivation for this activity? And you discover that it's your element of irreducible rascality. So, however, the teacher, once he's seen that you've mastered that lesson, has something still more ingenious. He says, now you've successfully made purpose, because finding out that you could not truly concentrate was valuable, because it began to prick the illusion of your ego. But you've only got your foot in the door. Beyond this are many, many higher things to be attained, and you must redouble your efforts. And so, of course, you apply yourself all the more, commencing again on all sorts of tricks that these old gentlemen can produce, and you will keep at it just as long as he can make you fall for it. But in the end, you see that it was all tricks. As the great Zen master Rinzai said, well, after all, there was nothing much in the entire doctrine of Buddhism. And he proceeded to explain to his students that the art of Zen, or the teaching of Zen, is like deceiving a child with an empty fist. You entice a child by pretending you've got something very precious in your fist, and you can play a game, thereby provoking the child to ever greater enthusiasm to find out what you've got. And in the end, the revelation is that there was nothing. So many people say, in the course of their Zen training, I realized there was nothing to realize. It was all there from the beginning. Because you see, standing opposite to the realization that you can't do anything about it, the equivalent that you can't not do anything about it, comes the flash, the awakening, that the reason for that is there is no you separate from you. In other words, when you try to control your thoughts or control your feelings, there is no difference between the thoughts and the controller, because what you call the thinker is simply your thought of yourself. The thinker is a thought among thoughts, and the feeler a feeling among feelings. And trying to control thoughts with thoughts is like trying to bite your own teeth. So you found that out. Well, then the other side of the picture is, of course, that if you do find that out, you discover that the project of controlling yourself was unnecessary, because you were yourself a Buddha from the very beginning. That's what the Upanishads mean when they say, quite simply, Tat Tavam Asi, you're it, you as you are. How can you imagine that? Supposing you let your imagination go and truly think through what you would like to happen. Imagine the most magnificent state of bliss that you can conceive, where there are no worries, no anxiety, no haunting future with unpleasant consequences. You're in control of the entire system, and you're sitting on your lotus, perfectly content. And I ask you seriously, is that truly what you want? Are you quite sure that's what you want? Imagine now, let's get this situation straight. You've got everything you want. You're in the highest possible spiritual state that you can conceive, and yet I have really surrendered myself because I know it will allow something I don't know. So please, the surprise is, you know what would happen? You would find yourself sitting here in this building tonight, feeling exactly the way you feel this evening. Because after all, don't you have it all? Look, you have the feeling of self, but the feeling of self depends on there being, at the same time, the contrast, the feeling of other. The self has a certain sensation of being in control of life to some extent through voluntary action. The will seems to possess a certain freedom. And yet, on the other hand, there are limits to that, and it seems in the end, life sweeps us away and we are overwhelmed by the involuntary. And yet, the voluntary keeps popping up. New volunteers come into the world with everybody. So, you see, you couldn't have the experience you call being a voluntarily acting self without the contrast of the involuntary happening. Now, do you want to be without the involuntary happening? You want to get rid of that, right? If you get rid of it, you won't have the experience of the voluntary self. What would you like to turn it the other way around? Have the experience of no will for yourself, and on the other hand, everything just happens. Well, then you say, well, I'm not certain about that, because then I would feel at first that I was floating, that I had no further responsibilities, as if walking on air. And we do get that feeling sometimes. If you take the notions of determinism and fatalism to their ultimate conclusion, you do have that sense of freedom from all responsibility, freedom from worry and care, and you float along, but it wears off. You somehow don't seem to be able to follow out that philosophy, especially if you have children, and somehow society begins to pressure you to be responsible, just as it pressures children to be responsible. And so this nagging duality keeps returning. I cannot attain the nice, irresponsible state of involuntary behavior unless I have the contrast of the possibility of the voluntary, and vice versa. And what does that imply? Obviously, it means that these two aspects, or sides, of our experience, which we can label the voluntary and the involuntary, the knower and the known, the subject and the object, the self and the other, although appearing to be two, are indeed one, because you can't have one without the other. And when that state of affairs arises, you know at once that there's a conspiracy, that two things which look as different can be are, for that very reason, the same. Now, you can detect even underneath those actions of yours, which you call voluntary, the voluntary movement of the muscles or of the mind, that there are processes which are not voluntary. You do not will your blood to circulate. You do not control by intention the synapses in your nervous system. And yet you would be incapable of any voluntary action unless those involuntary processes were ongoing. So, you see, these two things go together. And you begin to realize something which is rather difficult to describe, that what you call your experience is a do happening. We don't have suitable words for this. We have some words which carry this sort of sense, like the word cleave, which means to stick together, to hold together, and also to split. And the word sacra in Latin means holy and accursed. And so I would like to propose we should find some word for a do happening, because it's all a do happening. That's what Buddhists mean when they talk about karma. The word karma means action. And when something happens to you, be it good or bad, they say it is your karma. That means, quite simply, it is your doing. But you say, I didn't intend to do that. Now, one school of thought will explain it by saying, but you see, you did something in a former life or at a former time, which now has this consequence. But that's a very superficial understanding of karma. You don't need to believe in reincarnation to understand karma. Karma is simply that you don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. That is one aspect. You are doing what you call the environment. And with the other aspect, you are doing what you call the organism, the me, this living body. But as you cannot possibly conceive the existence of a living body with no environment, that is the clue that the two are fundamentally one, like the two poles of a magnet. North is quite different from south, and yet it's all one metal. So, in precisely the same way, you are both what you do and what happens to you, so that you have a little game in which you pretend that what happens to you that you're not responsible for, that's not you. See, you're only responsible for this side of it, and then you can compete with the other side. What it's like is this. Get 2 knitting pins, 1 in each hand, and have a fencing match with yourself. And really sincerely try to stab the other hand. But that other hand must really sincerely be trying to stab the first one and also to defend itself. It's like playing chess with yourself. You see, now it won't work. You'll come to a sort of standstill unless you decide for your right hand that that's the one that's really going to win. Well, then you've broken the rule of the game, you see. That's what is termed by both the Hindus and the Buddhists of India as avidya, which really better translates to ignorance. So what it comes down to, you see, is basically, just in the same way that the authority of the guru is your authority, you can say the place where you are in life is where you've put yourself. And just as on the surface of the sphere, every point may be regarded as the center of the surface, so every place may be regarded as the true place. And everyone's in his true place. Everybody, in other words, put it in whatever language you will, is a manifestation of the divine, playing this game, that game, and the other game. And you're not knowing it, if you don't know it, is part of the game. It makes it all the more fun. Get lost. You save yourself, and last you get. Children love to play hide and seek to get lost. Like we all like to go to a play, see a horror movie, and have the cold shivers because we think the awful is going to happen. Something is going to be seen on the screen which we can't bear to see. Well, that will be thrilling. We all expose ourselves to them, just as children and young people are always exposing themselves to dreadful things. And the parents get absolutely frenzied. If it isn't getting drunk or driving hot rods, they take drugs, and that may ruin their sanity for life. How horrible can it be? And if they don't take drugs, they all do something else, always to see how close to the point of danger you can get. And those people who go in for racing games usually end up in the crash and the inevitable. But the life is all the sweeter for being played dangerously. So I would say to those among you who are most deadheads in the sense of unspiritual and square, if there are any here or listening, congratulations. You see, you're playing a very far out game. See, you're so lost, you don't even know where you stand. That's taking a gargantuan risk. Why? Because of you, we might even blow up the planet, just in the same way as that car racer watches the needle going up, 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 up there. These people feeling more and more and more righteous, determined the good shall prevail, watching that needle go up. It's getting harder and harder and harder. And finally, they go out in a blaze. Sound of brief music. Then, when the dust settles, let's say, that was the first act. I mean, that was quite a dream we've woken up from. See where we go next. Because that's the point. Simple. That's why I would say that my function is liberation. I want you to see that it's you. It's not me. It's not Swami so-and-so. It's not Guru so-and-so. It's not Saint so-and-so. It's you who do it. As Sir Edwin Arnold put the words into the mouth of the Buddha, you suffer from yourselves, none else compelled. None other holds you, that you live and die, and whirl upon the wheel, and hug and kiss its spokes of agony, its tire of tears, its neighbors, nothing. And when one of the old Zen masters went to his teacher and said, what is the way to liberation? The teacher said, who is restraining you? He said, no one. If so, why should you ask for liberation? It all bounces back to you. What do you want? Do you know what you want? Can you think it through? Say exactly what. And invariably, you'll get back to the place where you are. Because what you say you want is always the symptom, the expression of what you are now. If that is the case, that it's all there because you're doing it, why meditate? Why do anything of a so-called spiritual nature? People don't really understand what meditation is. They take it up, but they take it up like psychotherapy or a course in weight reduction in order to be better. But if you do that, you are not practicing what is called dhyana or yoga. Then that's not it at all. Meditation is the one human activity which has no purpose. Buddhas, who are supposed to have obtained everything, are invariably shown in some sort of meditation posture. Why should they meditate anymore? Because that just happens to be the way that a Buddhist sits when he sits. When he sits, he sits. When he walks, he walks. He's not going anywhere. He's just going for a walk because he did see. To dig the word, very workman. is not merely to appreciate, but to penetrate, to go to the heart of the matter. And to penetrate the moment, to get right to the root of the moment, is nowhere else than the center of you. Where you are is where you start this whole thing. So to get with yourself is to get at the moment where you begin all this. The question is, where does the question come from? Where does the desire spring from? Well, that's you. And that you is the point from which the whole universe is created, flowing back into the past like the wake of a ship. The wake doesn't drive the ship. So you are producing it. Meditation is just sitting and watching that. And it's not done because it's good for you. It's done for fun. I might even say meditation is a fun thing. And if it isn't, you're not meditating. There's an awful game that meditators play, which is competitive suffering. Now, they go to some place where they sit for hours on end until their legs ache and practically fall off. And they'll come back and brag about how they sat through all those hours of negation. Now, it's been difficult to put down people who are suffering because, after all, one has a natural sympathy for pain. But I sometimes want to say, for goodness sake, don't throw your suffering at me in that way, in that spirit of. Don't brag about it. Don't one-up me by saying, well, I've suffered more than you have. People do things like that. They say, well, I'm more aware of my shortcomings than you are. I'm more tolerant than you are. I recognize more than you do what a rascal I am. In every kind of way, one-upping somebody else in order to play the game in which I always win. So once we get into that kind of thing with the meditation scene, we get into hierarchies and ranks and degrees, and who's attained number 7, who has attained number 9. And the expert guru will always put a stage higher than anybody's thought of, just to see how far your ambition will run. So this goes on endlessly, until you suddenly wake up and begin real meditation by realizing that you were there, that you do really meditate all the time by virtue of existing all the time. Only you miss that eternal. Now, by always looking for something next minute, expecting a result. Now, in Zen, we learn not to expect the result because one does anything. So you may just as well sit and enjoy.